It's the Big Take from Bloomberg News and iHeartRadio. I'm Wes Kosova. Today, the men who helped Carlos Ghosn escape from Japan are looking to get paid. You might remember just before New Year's in 2019, Carlos Ghosn, the high-flying auto executive, vanished from Japan just as he was facing charges of financial crime.
It was the arrest that shocked the financial world. Automotive titan Carlos Ghosn was put on trial in Japan for alleged financial misconduct and misuse of corporate resources, allegations that he denied.
Soon after, Ghosn turned up in Beirut, Lebanon, and he's remained there ever since, living in luxury and beyond the reach of Japanese authorities. The story didn't end quite as well for the two Americans who orchestrated and helped carry out Ghosn's escape. The father and son team faced prosecution and prison. They say Ghosn told them he would help them out if things went wrong, and now they want him to make good on that promise and pay millions of dollars they owe in legal bills. My colleagues Brian Bremner in London and Reed Stevenson in Seoul have been following every twist and turn of this saga, and they join me now. Brian Bremner, Reed Stevenson, thanks so much for being here.
Delighted to be here, Wes.
Pleasure to be here.
Brian, maybe we should just start with you. You have been on this story from the very beginning. Can you tell us about Carlos Ghosn?
Carlos Ghosn is the Davos man, the most interesting man in the world in a lot of senses. He's had a fascinating upbringing. He was born in Brazil, spent part of his childhood in Lebanon, was educated at the higher level in France, speaks multiple languages, and early in his career became kind of known as being a ruthless cost cutter. He ran Michelin's North American operation. He was instrumental when Renault was privatized and just a hot mess in turning that around, and then became something of a global figure when Renault dispatched him to Japan right around the turn of the millennium and in 1999 or so, and was given the task of turning around Nissan. Now, back then, Nissan was a national champion in a world of hurt. Everything about the company was kind of going wrong, and he came in and just started throwing grenades around. I mean, he smashed the Japanese seniority system to smithereens. He started closing plants. He started upending supply lines. He started doing everything that Japanese executives never did. And the whole Keiretsu system, the convoy system, where you never made much of a ripple, he just started tearing everything apart, and it worked. Nissan kind of came back from the dead, and he became a cultural figure, a phenomenon in Japan. I mean, there were manga, Japanese comic books that were portraying him as the savior of Japanese businesses. I spent about 2 months trailing him back in those days for a cover story of Business Week and kind of saw him interact with staff. And he would go into a factory and it was like a rock star, entering an arena. I mean, people went crazy. So everything was kind of going his way. I mean, this was an interesting point in Japanese business history because corporate Japan was starting to experiment with bringing in foreign executives to change things. So as the 2000s moved into the 2010s, he was starting to build a really interesting car alliance between obviously Renault and Nissan, and then Mitsubishi Motors was added to the mix later on. Then things started to get complicated. Initially, Renault was the stronger partner, right? They came in and they turned everything around, but over time, Nissan started to become stronger, and the whole equity arrangement was very unfair from the Japanese perspective, right? So that's when the trouble started for Ghosn. There was kind of like a group of Nissan executives who didn't like the direction that Carlos Ghosn was, taking the alliance and wanted to rectify what they thought was a very unfair system. And that kind of led to the legal trouble that Carlos Ghosn ended up getting into in 2018.
Reed, Brian says things started to take a turn. What exactly was Ghosn doing at that time that led him down a completely different path?
So it was right around 2016 when the French government went to Ghosn and basically asked him to make the alliance irreversible. Renault owned 43% of Nissan. Nissan owned 15% of Renault, but didn't have voting rights. And so therefore, even though Nissan was sending dividends to Renault and was churning out more cars every year than the French car company, it had very little say in how Renault was run, whereas Renault had an awful lot to say in how Nissan was run through its shareholding and through the fact that Ghosn was also the CEO of Renault at the time. And on top of that, Renault was partly owned by the French government. But going back to when the French government asked Ghosn to make the alliance irreversible, it meant, cement the relationship, right? Make it long term. Now, people within Nissan saw this as a merger play. So they thought that the companies would be irreversibly combined. What we learned afterwards was that Ghosn was essentially trying to set up a holding company structure. So to create sort of a super car company under a single holding company, which would actually return some independence to Nissan. It was in early 2018 when a small group of executives within Nissan got alarmed over this. And around the same time, basically an auditor within Nissan started to question some of the financial dealings that Ghosn had. It actually had to do with plane tickets for his family. And as they dug deeper, they started to wonder whether there was any wrongdoing going on here. And they hadn't uncovered a whole lot. But one of the things that they did was they ended up getting in contact with prosecutors from the Tokyo District Court. And the prosecutors saw a bit of an opportunity here. They saw that potentially they had a big sort of target that they could go after. When November 2018 rolled around, basically there was a plan in place. Ghosn would be flown to Tokyo, and we learned later on as the case developed that essentially these charges were used to access even more information that was held by Ghosn. For example, at one of his offices in Beirut, an apartment that he had in Brazil. And so in 2019, early 2019, you saw a new set of charges, more serious, levied against Ghosn.
Brian, so Japanese authorities are moving in on Ghosn, and he starts thinking about what his next move should be.
That's right. He's now he's a participant in the Japanese legal system. And for people who aren't familiar with it, it's not Club Med. It is a really tough situation that Ghosn's in. He's facing round-the-clock interrogations, long periods of incarceration where he can barely even talk to, his wife, let alone his lawyers. A lot of pressure techniques from Japanese prosecutors trying to get him to plead guilty. I mean, once you enter the Japanese legal system at this point, there is something like a 99.9% conviction rate. I mean, it's really game over when it's kind of reached this point. So the guy is desperate. Ghosn's options are nil, right? He's in a really tough spot. And behind the scenes, the outlines of a plot to get Ghosn out of Japan start to take hold.
The story continues when we come back. When this plan is being formulated to get Ghosn out of the country, he wasn't aware of it.
So around the middle of 2019, Ghosn can't see his wife, Carol, because essentially she has left the country. He's not allowed to contact her except for on, special occasions. Any internet access he has to be done at his lawyer's office. So his ability to even sort of coordinate any sort of plan to get out of Japan is somewhat limited. But he does make contact with people who can help him. over the course of probably half a year, maybe a little bit less, he's being told, get ready, get fit, make your preparations, don't tell anybody. And indeed, it was only a tiny number of people who even knew this discussion was taking place.
Brian, so here's Carlos Ghosn appearing in this splashy photo in Beirut. He'd gotten out. How did he get out of Japan? The man was being observed 24 hours a day.
Yeah, I mean, it's an amazing story, almost, James Bond-like in a lot of respects, because he was under a fair bit of surveillance at this point in time. But he did manage to get on the Shinkansen, the bullet train, and get down to Osaka and Kansai International Airport. I think they stayed at a hotel to get their plans together. I think the genius of this plot was to take advantage of relatively lax security at the private jet hangars at Kansai International Airport. Once they got to Osaka, the next step was how do they get Ghosn onto a private jet that they arranged. And what they did is they took an empty audio equipment box, and he actually just went into it. He was smuggled through
There's like a big case that you would use, like a concert tour would use to put all kinds of, speakers and audio gear. So it was big enough to fit a man.
Right. It was big enough to conceal a guy the size of Ghosn, and he got through the security at the hangar, and they were able to get the box onto a private jet that was, heading out to Istanbul. So from Istanbul, they were able to get him onto another private jet that went to Beirut, Lebanon, the place of his childhood, his ancestors, his spiritual home, so to speak. But more importantly, Lebanon doesn't have an extradition treaty with Japan. So there was no way Japanese law enforcement or international law enforcement at that point were going to be able to get their hands on Ghosn.
And since then, he's just set up his life in Beirut. He can't go anywhere else, but he seems to be living pretty well.
Yes. And, he started to have the semblance of a normal life again. He was able to hike and swim and spend time with his family.
Reed, you've now written a story about the two men who were responsible for smuggling Carlos Ghosn out of Japan and getting him to Beirut. Who are they, and how did they do this?
So right after Ghosn sets foot in Beirut, the names of the people who actually helped him escape start to emerge. And it's Michael Taylor and his son, Peter Taylor. So Michael Taylor is an American who first set foot in Beirut in 1983 as a U.S. Army Special Forces Green Beret, and really sort of intertwined himself with the country. He learned how to speak Arabic. He married a Lebanese woman, had 3 sons with her, and trained Lebanese militia. And then after he left the U.S. Army, he ended up becoming a sort of a security contractor. Peter Taylor had sort of helped his father in sort of liaising with Ghosn. Michael Taylor had done these sorts of extractions before. He had gone and retrieved children abducted by an estranged parent and these sorts of things. And so their names are coming out much more frequently, their role in the escape, their background, and it's attracting a lot of attention. Now, with Ghosn having slipped out of their hands, the government wants some sort of retribution. And so what they do is very swiftly issue arrest warrants for the Taylors. And so then for them, the question becomes whether they evade the risk of being arrested if they go back to the U.S. or not. Lawyers advise them that they probably shouldn't go, but also told them that the risk of being extradited back to Japan were relatively low. And so they do indeed go back to the U.S. And in May of 2020 at this point, U.S. Marshals swoop in on their home in Massachusetts and arrest them, and formal extradition proceedings start to take place.
And so they are extradited to Japan, and what happens next?
So after the extradition, their strategy changes. They're no longer trying to fight the charges. They're trying to plead guilty and get the best possible deal that they can. And that's exactly what happened in court. And Michael Taylor was actually a little bit emotional and very contrite before the judges in Japan. And he said, yes, we did it. We regret it. And then they were sentenced. Life in Japanese prison is not easy, particularly for perhaps a foreigner. And Michael and Peter had kind of a rough time. I mean, Michael in particular had long stretches of solitary confinement. His father passed away during his incarceration, and he wasn't able to really talk to him toward the end. Eventually, they were shipped back to the U.S. So they actually spent about 16 months behind bars in Japan, and then were eventually, let go out of the U.S. prison system.
Where things go from here when we return. So the Taylors had paid their debt in Japanese prison. They come back to the U.S., but all is not well with the Taylors.
Indeed. I mean, they get back to the U.S., they've been fairly kind of scarred by the experience. They've got lives to rebuild. Peter Taylor, still in his 20s, he and his father are looking at, a lot of bills to pay. So by their telling, the actual extraction had cost about $1.3 million. I would say about two-thirds of that was already paid by Ghosn, but they do say that there were some other out-of-pocket costs that weren't fully sort of repaid. But on top of that, the Taylors together had spent about $3 million fighting the extradition in legal fees as well as lobbying efforts.
And what is their relationship with Ghosn now? How do they feel about Ghosn? They're saddled with all this debt. Ghosn is living in the lap of luxury in Beirut.
I would describe the relationship between the Taylors and Ghosn as complicated, right? Because on one hand, they do have a certain amount of sympathy for him because they essentially went through the same Japanese sort of punishment system that Ghosn did. And so they do sympathize with him and his situation. But on the other hand, they paid a very high cost for his freedom. And so they want to at least be made whole. As they kind of came out of the system, one of their lawyers even made his way to Beirut to try and, sort things out, but met a bit of resistance or just couldn't really get the conversation going. And so, we're now seeing this kind of limbo situation where it's kind of a delicate dance, right? They've gone public with the information that they do want to be made whole by Carlos Ghosn. He himself has been sort of very careful and measured in his response when I was able to put the question to him. And to a certain extent, the story is not quite finished because we just don't know how it's going to turn out.
Did the Taylors have an arrangement with Ghosn that he would pay all of this money and help them out if something went bad?
Well, I mean, during the formulation of the plot and the execution of the plot, there wasn't like a lot of detailed discussions about the financial arrangements, but they seemed to, at least from the Taylors' point of view, had a kind of a rough kind of understanding that if things went really bad, if they went pear-shaped, if the Taylors were caught, ended up going through, legal proceedings, that Carlos Ghosn would make them whole. I mean, there was an anecdote in our story during the actual flight out of Japan when Michael Taylor said, "Hey, I freed you. Are you going to look after us?" And Carlos Ghosn said, "Yes, of course." Over time, the understanding on each side may have changed a bit. During the period after they got out of jail, I think they felt that they hadn't heard from Ghosn for a bit. Peter Taylor told us at one point that he felt like Ghosn had never said thank you. A lawyer who had represented the Taylors had gone to Beirut, presumably to start talking about financial matters, and Ghosn canceled the meeting at the last second.
Brian, one interesting thing in the story is that the Taylors really seem to see themselves as victims in all this, that they have been done wrong. And one question I just had was, they smuggled a guy out of Japan in a box to evade prosecution. Do they not know that that was going to bring them some sort of trouble?
Well, I think in Michael Taylor's world, the moral line is a bit fuzzy. I mean, I think Michael was motivated by a sense of outrage that Carlos Ghosn was being treated unfairly by the system. I mean, there were family mutual ties to Lebanon that probably made Carlos Ghosn a bit of a sympathetic figure. But when you talk to both Taylors today, they have no regrets about doing this. And, you know, in their ethical universe, this is a completely legitimate thing to do.
Ghosn, meanwhile, has denied the charges against him. Here he is in an interview with Bloomberg last year describing his situation in Lebanon.
My question to you, though, is will you physically go to France to face these charges?
But I cannot. What you seem to say, okay, I'm sitting in Lebanon and I can fly. I have no passport. I am forbidden.
That didn't stop you from leaving Japan.
To leave Lebanon. You know, people ask me the question if like I'm, sitting down in a place where I'm free to move. Let's not forget that there is a red notice which has been asked by Japan, which practically positioned me in Lebanon until this red notice is moved up. And unless it is removed, I cannot move from Lebanon. I'm under the Lebanese justice system and under the Lebanese jurisdiction, and we just need to acknowledge that.
Reed, you went to Beirut and actually met with Carlos Ghosn. What's he like now?
He's living what I would sort of describe as a life of semi-retirement. As we've discussed, he does have deep roots there. He owns a winery in Beirut. He owns some businesses. When I met with him and we actually sat down to talk in the restaurant of a hotel that's within walking distance of his house, we would be interrupted every 4 or 5 minutes by somebody who wanted to stop and say hello and pay his or her respects to Ghosn. And, he was sort of in his element there. So he did get his freedom. But on the other hand, he's bitter. He was toppled from the heights of corporate power and has to live this life. And in Lebanon, there's an arrest warrant out by both the French and Japanese governments now that essentially kind of trap him in the country.
Obviously, first, I don't consider myself as a prisoner in Lebanon. I'm very happy to be here, I can tell you. And I prefer this prison to the one where I was before, you can imagine. And particularly here, I'm with my friends, I'm with my family. My kids can come visit me. I can use the phone. I can use internet. I don't have followers. Frankly, I don't feel at all unhappy in Lebanon. I'm ready to stay a long time in Lebanon. But please do not consider that I'm just accept this as it is. I'm going to fight because I have to clear my name. And this is something which is extremely important to me. I can't accept the fact that fabricating a story and lying about something at such a scale can win or can prevail. I can't accept it.
So that's Carlos Ghosn and the Taylors, but Ghosn left behind quite a trail of wreckage at his old company. What's happened since, and where did they go from here?
Carlos Ghosn spent a big part of his career building this massive alliance, kind of anchored by Renault and Nissan. One of the big ironies of this entire story is that it's all been kind of crumbling since then. Like any other auto company, they're facing all the disruptive forces of the EV revolution and things like that. But it's also true, I think, that Nissan in particular took kind of a reputational hit from this whole saga. And they're now trying to renegotiate the terms of the alliance. And it's not clear how this is all going to turn out for Ghosn's biggest accomplishment.
Reed Stevenson, Brian Bremner, thanks so much for talking to me today.
My pleasure.
Pleasure. This was great.
You can read more about Carlos Ghosn from Reed Stevenson and Brian Bremner at Bloomberg.com. Thanks for listening to us here at The Big Take, a daily podcast from Bloomberg and iHeartRadio. For more shows from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. Read today's story and subscribe to our daily newsletter at Bloomberg.com/BigTake. And we'd love to hear from you. Email us with questions or comments to bigtake@bloomberg.net. The supervising producer of The Big Take is
Vicky Vergolina.
Our senior producer is
Catherine Fink.
Our producer is
Federica Romaniello.
An associate producer is
Zainab Siddiqui.
Hilda Garcia.
Is our engineer. Original music by Leo Sidran. I'm Wes Kosova. We'll be back tomorrow with another Big Take.